Alright guys, welcome to another episode of Louis Too Much Analyzes Comics. I'm going to be continuing my series on The Question, and I'm going to be reviewing issues 13 and 14. Now, if you saw my last video, I concluded by saying that these next two issues are two of my favorites from the whole series, and I reread them, and they were just as good as I remembered them, and so I'm really excited about this review. And also a little bit nervous because I want to do justice to these stories in my analysis, and so I hope that I do that. With that said, let's just get right in. All right, so the comic opens with this army recruiter. He's pitching this guy who's coming in to join the army. And the guy who comes in, he listens to the whole spiel, and then after he listens to the spiel, he ends up brandishing a knife, and stabbing the guy with the knife, and telling him that he already is all that he can be, but that the guy that he stabbed is not. Now, this gentleman that killed the army recruiter, his name is Billy. And he's going to play, obviously, into the plot a little bit more later. From there, we go to Todd's house, where Vic is doing his stretches, the yoga stretches that he does, and Todd ends up asking him, how it is that he can do this to himself, because he basically does those pretzel maneuvers where you pull your feet behind your head. And so Todd ends up asking him, how can you torture your body that way? And Vic ends up telling Todd that it's because of one dirty word, and that dirty word is discipline. It's a word that everyone hates, but it's what's necessary in order for him to do this. And so this right here is, Denny does this fairly frequently in The Question. He kind of reveals his theme right up front. He does it a lot in conversations between Vic and Todd, where essentially the theme of the story is going to be posed as a question, typically by Todd to Vic, and then essentially the story plays on those ideas. And so discipline is going to be a big theme in this story, why discipline is important. And there's something else that Todd ends up asking him, because they end up having this discussion about discipline and what the difference is between discipline and coercion. And so Vic tells Todd that coercion comes from the outside, and so coercion comes essentially from social pressure, right? And or some external pressure, right? Because it could even be something as simple as you need to eat, right? And so that's an external pressure, and so you might get a job because you need to eat, right? So that's an external pressure. You're not doing the job because internally you desire to do the job, you do technically desire internally to eat, but it's also because it's a necessity for you to eat, and so that pressure makes you go and get a job, right? But discipline is something that you actually feel strongly about, that you actually want. There's a goal that you want to achieve, and so in order to get to that goal, you discipline yourself because ultimately you want to live in accord with that. Basically, you want to live a lifestyle that allows you to reach the goal that you're trying to reach. And so this leads Todd to ask the question, where does fanaticism come from? And Todd is kind of poking fun at Vic in the sense that, what Vic does is a little bit fanatical. He puts on a mask and he fights crime. And so Todd is asking the question as, like I said, poking fun at Vic. But it's also a question that's going to be answered. It's not actually answered, but it's touched upon throughout the whole story. And essentially, where does the line get blurred between following or disciplining yourself so that you can pursue a goal, and when does that discipline become fanaticism? Is there a line between the two? And I think that there is. And is fanaticism something that we should be concerned about? Now, all of this is taking place in a pre 9/11 world. Post 9/11, that seems to be one of the chief concerns of our culture today. The idea of fanaticism, right? Because any sort of fanaticism leads obviously to terrorist actions, or can lead to terrorist actions. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, does it depend on what you're fanatical about? Can you be fanatical about certain things? Because I do tend to think that certain temperaments are kind of by nature a little bit more fanatical than others. And so is fanaticism the problem, or is it what you're fanatical about? Whereas, like, because there are certain things that you can be fanatical about, and so then when you're trying to serve that end, you end up doing all kinds of bad things along the way. Versus if you're fanatical about something else, let's give an example, right? Let's say that you're fanatical about love. And when I use the word love, I don't mean it in the romantic sense or in the kind of modern cultural I don't mean it in the sense that our culture typically uses the word love. Although I think our culture uses the word love to mean all kinds of different things. But I think that, like when we talk about love as an abstract concept in our culture, typically what that means is that we care intimately about somebody else, but also that we kind of go along with that we tolerate essentially whatever the other person does. We kind of just want whatever it is that makes that person happy to happen. Now, that version of love can sometimes be good, but I would say that version of love is limiting, because sometimes what makes other people happy isn't actually what's good for them. And so I would actually say that if we're committed to an even higher an even higher version of love, which is a love that seeks everybody else's good, and that doesn't mean that you get to impose that good on other people. It means that you do genuinely care about the other person, but also that you want the other person to thrive and to succeed. And if you're fanatical about that sort of a concept, I can't really see why that would be good. Now, maybe I pointed it out myself by saying that, like, the sort of person that is fanatical about that might try and impose what's good on other people, through some kind of like hierarchical power structure, and that wouldn't, that sort of fanaticism, in my opinion, wouldn't be good. But I don't know. Maybe being fanatical is bad no matter what the situation is. And so, anyways, that's the question that Tot poses, right? Is where does fanaticism come from? And again, the idea there being, what's the divide between being disciplined for a cause and being fanatical for a cause, right? All right. So after Tot asks the question, they're interrupted because Vic gets a phone call, and they let him know that the bridge leading into Hub City is collapsing, and a bunch of cars have already fallen into the ocean, and there's a bunch of people that are injured. And so Vic goes running over there, as a reporter. He goes running over there to cover the story, and once he gets there, he ends up finding out that the police have just been like kind of standing around while people have actually fallen into the ocean, and they're drowning. And so Vic gets really upset at them, and he ends up jumping into the ocean so that he can save the people that have fallen in. And he ends up finding this kid in a car, and he breaks him out of the car. He brings him up to the surface, and he turns him over to the paramedics. And while he's standing around, there's this gentleman that just like Billy earlier in the story, there's this gentleman that shows up and who's going to play a larger role in the story later. And he ends up giving Vic his coat, and Vic ends up noticing that the guy has a limp, and this guy says, let me help the kid. Let me try and resuscitate him, because the kid has been underwater for so long. He tries resuscitating him, giving him CPR, and it turns out that the kid dies, or that the kid died, and there's no way to bring him back. And so the cops are kind of like, oh man, that's so sad. And Vic, starts yelling at them and telling them, man, you guys we're all just sitting around doing nothing. One of you guys could have rescued him, but you didn't. You didn't care to rescue him. You didn't fulfill your obligation as police officers. And this is also something that's kind of gonna be touched upon in the story, because Myra has a subplot in the story, and that's kind of the theme of her subplot. And so Myra shows up and she starts asking questions how it is that this happened, and it turns out that that sometime before, somebody had actually alerted the city that the bridge was nearing collapse. You know, it had worn out, it was old, and so it was nearing collapse, and but nobody did anything about it, even though this gentleman had this inspector had submitted a report stating that this was the case. And so now Myra wants to get to the bottom of things, because you know, obviously she's concerned about the citizenry. And again, she ends up telling Vic the same thing that she told him in the last issue. You asked me why I want to get into politics. This is why I want to get into politics, because I want to help people, and I actually want to fix the infrastructure of Hub City. I won't get to that yet because it comes a little bit later in the story, but I want to touch on something that that Myra says later, but we'll get there when we get there. All right, so after this scene, we are reintroduced to the gentleman that gave Vic his coat, and his name is Colonel DeBlanc. And Colonel DeBlanc, he gives this is him right here. He gives a speech to a group of army men, and he ends up talking about how America and the moral values of Americans are slowly deteriorating. And, you know, essentially it's that idea that, you know, we're prosperous, and so we've become lazy because of our prosperity. We've become apathetic because of our prosperity. We have no values to cling to because of our prosperity, and so we've become soft and weak. And being soft and weak makes us vulnerable. And essentially, from the Colonel's perspective, this vulnerability will eventually lead to disaster, because essentially that's what typically happens with kingdoms in the past, right? Is like, as a kingdom becomes rich and powerful, it becomes arrogant, and in its arrogance it thinks that its prosperity is going to go on forever, and then something happens, and that prosperity is suddenly snatched away from them, and the citizenry is used to prosperity, and so that citizenry is not equipped to deal with the loss of the prosperity, and now the citizenry is open to essentially disaster. And so that's what this colonel is concerned about, the fact that America is getting closer and closer to this state. And so he's put together this team from the military, from his days in the military, and he wants to use them to prove a point to America. And he's going to do that by going after this elite military team called Team Bravo, and kill them in front of an audience, just to, you know, to basically prove the point that even America's best soldiers are weak. And so from there, we then go to Vic's news station. I'm going to kind of skip over a little bit of that. At the end of his broadcast, they end up finding out who it is that received that report that I mentioned earlier about the bridge, and why it is that he didn't turn it in, why it is that he didn't do anything. And so he explains to Vic and Myra, who's also at the station, that the report came in at 4:15. Quitting time for him, based on labor laws in Hub City and based on union rules, is 4:30. The report would have taken 30 minutes to log, and he was about to go on vacation, so he didn't have time to put in the report. And because of the fact that he didn't have time to put in the report, obviously the bridge collapsed and people died. And so Myra ends up trying to fire this guy, and she's like, you know, you're neglecting your duty. You're fired. And he's like, I don't think so, because I'm part of a union, and the union rules say that didn't do anything wrong, and so you can't fire me. And if you try and fire me, then the union's going to strike, and you're going to have no one left to do the job. So yeah, sorry about your luck. And then he leaves. And so this is, and then again, she ends up telling Vic, see, this is why I want to get into politics, because I want to fix these problems. And Vic tells her something very interesting. This is what I was like itching to talk about before, is he tells her, I hear you, but I'm not sure politics is the answer to this kind of problem. It may not be legislatable. Now, why do I want to talk about this so much? This story, Myra's subplot in this story is all about how, and actually I would say the general theme of this story is all about how individuals need to become self-disciplined, wise and self-disciplined, in order for a society to function. And there's this idea in our culture, right, that like people are bad because society makes them bad. And the reality is that, this is at least my perspective, people are both good and bad. So they have the potential to be good and they have the potential to be bad. All of us have within us, right, like these natural tendencies to do certain things that can be either good or bad, right? And so just as an example, what I mentioned before, right, we have this need to eat. And so that need to eat could drive us to contribute to society by, you know, working in some way that profits society, and then by virtue of us doing that work, we get paid, and then we get to eat, and so that could be a good thing. Now, that need to eat might also be used as a bad thing, right? That where we justify to ourselves, well, I need to eat, and so I need to do whatever it takes so that I can eat. And I want to be able to eat a lot. and so I need to do whatever it takes so that I can make as much money as possible and then eat a lot. And so that drive can actually be turned into something bad, because you might then go out and do all kinds of corrupt things so that you can get money, so that then you can eat a lot, right? Because you want to have a lot. And so ultimately it's the same drive, but different people are going to react to it in different ways. And so what I mean to say by we have the potential for both good and bad within us is we all have these drives inside of us, and then it depends on individuals to make individual choices as to whether or not we're going to allow those drives to make us do bad things or make us do good things. And in this case, the point that Vic is making is, just because somebody at the top, right, like Myra, who is a genuinely good person, even though she's made a bunch of mistakes throughout her life, which is something that's going to be discussed later on in the story, just because somebody like that gets put in a position of power, she's not going to be able to legislate to all the people underneath her that they have to be good, because you'd have to create such an intense bureaucracy that micromanages every single human being doing every, you know, at every moment of their life, that it would be completely impossible unless you want to create like a, you know, essentially like a police state where there's cameras in our houses like in 1984 that essentially watch us to make sure that we're always doing what's right. And, you know, personally, I'm not interested in living in that sort of a society. I don't want morality to be legislated from the top. My preference is, what I think Vic is arguing for here, is that morality would actually come from individuals. So each individual makes the choice to do what's good and right, and then society will function in the correct fashion. And so in the case of, like, for example, the police officers, right? Their job is to help people. And, you know, in an ideal situation, the sort of person that would become a police officer is the sort of person that wants to help people. That's why they've taken upon themselves this badge and this responsibility, right? But they're just standing around because ultimately they're just doing it for a paycheck. And the same thing with this gentleman here, right? The one that doesn't turn in the report. He has all these laws that actually encourage him to do what's wrong, because he can, you know, he's about to go on vacation. He clocks out at 4:30. There's no reason for him to stay behind, even if it is going to be at the expense of other people. There's no reason for him, no selfish reason for him to stay and continue to work. Now, what would be nice, right, is if this guy would recognize, hey, yeah, you don't have to work past 4:30, but this is gonna kill people, so you need to stay to 4:45, and do your duty. And so that idea that each of us, through discipline, right? That's what Vic talks about at the beginning, that through discipline, each of us would grasp onto whatever it is that's going to be good for other people, not because some structure above us is telling us to do it. We're doing it because as individuals, we recognize that it's what we should do because it's what we would like to have done to us, right? It's that both Buddha, which I'm going to talk about this a little bit later too, but both Buddhism and Christianity have this idea within them. The two, major Eastern and Western religions have this idea within them: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's how you structure a society. That's how a good society operates, is if each person is actually doing that. That's kind of what I was talking about before in terms of love, that you actually want what's good for other people based on what you think would be good, based on what you think is the good that you'd like to have done to you. And so that, if a society can operate off of that principle, then, then the society is in pretty good shape. And I think that that's the point that Vic is making, is that you can't legislate that. People have to decide that for themselves. And the only way that they can live that way is through, basically self-discipline, which is something that the two major religions from the West and the East have agreed upon for centuries. All right, let's keep going. So from here, the Bravo team is introduced. They're on national TV, and I'll kind of just skim through what happens. But basically, Colonel DeBlanc's team shows up in ninja outfits, challenges them to a fight, and it's only 4 of them, and the Bravo team is 7 of them, and they basically say, hey, look, there's 4 of us, there's 7 of you, we're outnumbered, let's have a fight, and let's see who wins, because if we win, we're proving that essentially America's elite fighting force, they're not all that they can be, which is what the army is supposed to make you, all that you can be. Well, we're going to prove that you're not all that you can be. And so they end up fighting, and they end up killing all of Team Bravo on not national TV, but local TV in Hub City. And so Vic is there, and he actually tries chasing after DeBlanc's team, who all get into a helicopter, and they start flying away. Vic tries to grab onto the helicopter, and he ends up falling off. But before he does that, he actually notices that one of the people dressed as a ninja has a limp, just like the gentleman that had given him the coat earlier. And it's the exact same sort of limp. And so, he doesn't jump to any conclusions, but he says, hey, maybe this is the same guy. It's too much of a coincidence. So he goes looking for the guy as the question, and this is when Billy comes back into the picture. Billy from the beginning of the story that killed the army recruiter with the knife. We're taken to a scene where DeBlanc and Billy are walking side by side, and Billy is telling him that he had done that, and DeBlanc ends up telling him, like, look, man, you need to stop doing this. There's no reason for you to go around killing these army recruiters. They're not really part of the problem. The problem is, lies much deeper, and, killing people in secret, that doesn't accomplish our goal, which is to prove to America on a grand scale that, that America is becoming weak. And so you doing that to army recruiters, there's no reason for it. And Billy starts defending himself and saying, no, Colonel, you told me that this was the right thing to do, that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And the Colonel he doesn't really have a leg to stand on because, obviously he just had his team assassinate a bunch of people. And so in the midst of this, the Question shows up. And so the Question ends up getting into a fight with all of DeBlanc's team. And DeBlanc ends up asking the Question how he recognized him, and the Question tells him, "Oh, I noticed that limp that you have." And so DeBlanc then is like, "Oh, well, then that must make you that guy that I gave my coat to." And the Question is like, "Oh, you're a clever man." And so it kind of puts them in this Mexican standoff, right? Because the Question knows that DeBlanc is the guy that had Team Bravo killed, and DeBlanc knows that the Question is Vic Sage. And so DeBlanc sends his men to attack the Question, and so the Question actually puts up a really good fight against them, even though they're four of the most highly skilled fighters in the world. Obviously, they just killed Team Bravo. Four of them against 7 members of Team Bravo. They're some of the most highly skilled fighters in the world. The Question actually fights them off pretty well, and so it ends up that they just overwhelm him, and finally they knock him down, and one of them is actually about to kill the Question, and DeBlanc holds the guy back and stops him from killing the Question because he's so impressed by the Question's fighting spirit as a warrior. It's basically everything that DeBlanc is looking for in a human being, right? It's somebody who has discipline, because they must be disciplined in order to train their body to do the sorts of things that the Question does. And so he ends up stopping his team, and instead of killing him, he wants to see if the Question can survive an ordeal. Is his discipline intense enough to survive this ordeal? And so he ends up taking the Question to some unnamed place and burying the Question. Whoops, the wrong page. Sorry about that. He ends up burying the Question in the ground with only his head sticking out. And by the way, man, this is one of the most striking images. I remember this, from when I was 18 and I first read this. I love this whole concept so much. It's it's kind of like that old Batman TV show Death Trap, but it's done in a way that's very clever, and it is. I love the old Batman TV show. I don't mean to cast aspersions on it. I know what it is. It's intended to be funny and silly. This is the Death Trap. That kind of silly concept, but done in a very serious way, and I love that. And so the Colonel explains to the Question why, or what it is that he's trying to accomplish here. And so he basically tells the Question that earlier in his life, he had been put through the same ordeal, and he wants to see if the Question can last as long as him. Now, the Question asks, what do I get out of it? Why don't I just ask you to kill me right now instead of going through this ordeal? What do I get out of it if I make it as long as you did? And so the Colonel actually makes a deal with him, and he tells him, if you make it as long as I do, or as I did, you get to go free. I'll unearth you and let you free. And so the Question, accepts that what choice does he have? Now, Billy is not in agreement with this plan, and he basically spends all of the Questions, all the time that the Question is buried underground, torturing the Question. He kind of teases him with food, even though the Question has that mask. He can't eat the food through the mask, and just taunting him, trying to drive the Question crazy, because ultimately Billy does not want the Question to go free. But also it's because it's revealed that Billy is really just a psychopath, and he's essentially set in contrast with this other gentleman who I forget his name, but there's this other gentleman on DeBlanc's team who is kind of the opposite of Billy. So he actually believes in what DeBlanc has taught them, which is these high-end values these morals. And he kind of explains to the question why it is that this team formed. And so he pretty much tells them, he tells the question that, they were in the military together with Colonel DeBlanc, and Colonel DeBlanc instilled in them these values, right? Honor, truthfulness, discipline, all those kinds of things. And so, all of them this team all bought into these ideas, and it actually gave them a reason to live like this. They were living for these ideals. But then the military ended up kicking the colonel out. And so they felt like the military actually betrayed their ideals, because how could they kick out this honorable man? And so that's why they end up leaving with the colonel, because they actually believe that the colonel is the kind of the embodiment of these ideals, and that the military has lost touch with those ideals, and that ultimately, if the military doesn't have those ideals, if the military is all about just propagating war, or making money, or whatever the case may be, then it's lost the plot. Like, that's not what being in the military is about. Being in the military is about being an honorable soldier and being taught to be an honorable soldier. And so that's why these men have gone off with the question. But like I said, it's revealed that Billy is in no way that sort of a person. He just went with them because he saw an opportunity to kill people, and the reality is that he's a sociopath. And so things are going to kind of come to a head between these three: the question, this other gentleman that unfortunately I forgot his name, and Billy. Now, while the question is buried underground, we continue Myra's subplot. And so what's going on is Myra is about to have her first public debate in her run for mayoral candidacy. And so Myra has hired this guy that was apparently like a big wig in terms of like helping politicians get elected, behind the scenes, like campaign writing, or like campaign structuring, and teaching politicians like how to project a good image, all of that kind of stuff. But then he ended up falling on hard times. He got arrested for some unnamed scandal or something like that, and so now he's down on his luck. And so Myra has hired him on to kind of rehabilitate him, but at the same time, she needs him. And so he's having her made up to dressed to the nines and all of that kind of stuff, and made to look a certain way, that projects a certain sort of image to the public. And she's kind of balking at this because she doesn't like this idea that she has to like be kind of fake in order to be a politician. And that's gonna allow me to talk for a minute here about how frustrating I find politics. Not because I think that politics in and of themselves are bad, but because I think that politics has sadly become just exactly what Myra is complaining about there, which is an image game. It's a popularity contest. And to me, that's not what politics should be. Politics should be two people with ideas, ideas that they're proposing, that are supposed to impact our society in one way or the other, and we're supposed to weigh those ideas out and determine based on our rationality and our position within the society, which of these ideas is going to work best, and from there, we vote for the candidate that's proposing the best ideas. But instead, what ends up happening is we essentially just vote for whoever we think is the most charismatic or the most attractive, or agrees with our belief systems, or whatever the case may be. And I find that so unfortunate. And because ultimately, like, what kind of a society are we interested in having if that's how we're voting, that we're voting, based on those credentials? We should be voting for people who actually have propositions that we agree with. And this has nothing to do with a right or left debate, because personally I don't fall on either end of the political spectrum. But because my frustration is actually with both sides of the political spectrum to that, in regards to that, because ultimately I think that people vote for things that are for reasons that are not really, I mean, I just said it, like just voting for things that they shouldn't be voting for characteristics that shouldn't matter whatsoever in terms of politics, because politics is not a morality issue. Politics is not like a philosophy versus philosophy. I mean, to a degree, there's philosophy versus philosophy, but like ultimately, like we should be analyzing what is it that this person, what policies does this person actually, what are they bringing to the table? How is it going to impact us? And we should vote for the person that we think has the best ideas. And also, by the way, it would be nice if we didn't hate the person that has different ideas than us, because, you know, they might just see the world from a different perspective. And that seems to me to be kind of logical, to not hate people that just think differently than us, because to a large degree, most of us think differently from each other based on the fact that we're just born differently from each other, with different genetic temperaments and all that kind of stuff. So to hate somebody else because they see the world in a different way seems to me to be kind of foolish and counterproductive to a good society, because if we're all hating each other, we're ultimately going to end up fighting with each other. And if we all end up fighting with each other, you know, eventually that society is going to crumble. So to me, I find Myra's critique here very valid. Now, unfortunately for her, she gets schooling from this gentleman who basically tells her, look, man, this is how politics work. So if you want to get into politics, then you're going to have to play the game. If you don't want to play the game, then don't get into politics. And see, my frustration is just that I think personally that most of the people that are in the game right now are people that enjoy playing the game a little too much and don't enjoy actually representing the people who voted them in. Now, that's just my perspective. I'm sure that I angered a whole bunch of you out there, whoever it is that's listening to or watching this video. I apologize if I did. Know that I love you, as I say at the end of every video. I don't say that to be mean or rude or anything like that. And if you disagree with me, like I said before, I don't hate people that I disagree with. In fact, I love people that I disagree with, and I love talking to people that I disagree with. So if you disagree, feel free to comment, and hopefully we can interact. But all right, back to the question, who is still buried underground, and he's slowly going nuts, as you can expect. He's trapped under the earth with only his head sticking out. He can't eat, he can't drink. So he's, you know, his mind is sizzling at this point. And so he starts he basically starts putting into practice all of the things that he learned from his martial arts training with Richard Dragon. And so the first thing that he does is he starts calling to mind memories. And what's funny about these memories is Denny O'Neil, if you've ever listened to any interview that I've listened to several of his interviews, at least all the ones that I've listened to, he always tells these stories about how terrible his childhood was growing up in a Catholic school. Because the nuns in the Catholic school, not all of them, but some of the more intense nut job ones, who, let's just say it right, they have not been convicted that their calling as Christians is to love their neighbor as themselves, but instead it's to beat their neighbor, to beat the evil out of their neighbor. Those kinds of nuns basically like abused, you know, from his perspective, they abused him as he was growing up. And so he kind of gives the question a similar sort of upbringing. And so what the question does is he retreats into his own memories, and he remembers this moment where a nun locked him away inside of a closet, and then Vic, you know, kind of stubbornly put up with the fact that he was in the closet. He wasn't going to apologize to the nun for what he had done, because he was going to, you know, stick to his guns and hold fast to the fact that he was right, and that fueled him to actually stay in the closet without, you know, any disturbance. And so now Vic basically relives that memory and kind of channels that same sort of righteous, you know, anger or whatever, stubborn anger, honestly, because there's not really anything righteous about that. But And so he channels that so that he can continue to persist in this situation. Now, Myra ends up having her first public debate, and what happens in the public debate is that all of her past is brought up in front of the crowd to see. And so again, it's pointed out that politics ends up being about the person rather than the policies. And again, I think that that's sad. Now, there's something to be said about what sort of policies is a person going to bring if they're a bad person. But at the same time, we have to have mercy on people, in the sense that, like, people are going to make mistakes. They're going to do things that we might perceive as wrong. And, maybe they currently perceive them as wrong. Maybe they don't. But again, just because we differ on certain moral perspectives doesn't mean that that person is not capable of creating policies that are going to work. Or they might be good in this one area and then bad in this other area because they're weak in this area. But this area is the area that matters in terms of politics. And so, who cares that they're bad in this area? They're good in this area. Let's focus on that instead of focusing on the bad stuff. But anyway, so that's what happens to Myra. She gets eviscerated by the press, and so when she goes backstage, she ends up throwing like a tantrum, and that guy that's her handler ends up telling her, like, sweetheart, and he uses that sort of language, but he tells her, like, sweetheart, like, get over it. Like, this is what the game is, right? So, all right. So from there, we're taken back to the question, who is again, trying his best not to snap, and he ends up having this interaction with that gentleman, the noble gentleman, who actually builds a little fire for the question so that the question won't freeze to death in the night, which is very kind of him. And so the question ends up using his meditative skills to ultimately knock himself out and fall asleep. And so then we're taken to this scene where Myra is also sleeping, and she's dreaming, and she has this dream where she's in a burlesque show, and she's essentially like stripping in front of a bunch of men who are like leering at her and shouting at her and all of that kind of stuff, demeaning her. And she ends up waking up and recognizing that that's what it feels like to be in politics. And look, again, this will be the last time that I say it, because I actually think it's the last time that it's discussed here, like how Myra feels. But it would be nice if we didn't make people feel that way. I understand that we have to critique ideas, but it would be nice if we could critique ideas instead of people. But, that's how it is. So what am I going to do about that? Except complain about it the way Myra does, and the way that Denny does through Myra. All right. So then finally we're going to stick with the question the rest of the way. The question is, it's getting towards the end of his ordeal. He's almost reached the same time as the Colonel has, but he starts thinking to himself, dude, like, I'm gonna snap, I'm going crazy. And there's this really crazy scene here where, like, a scorpion shows up and literally crawls onto Vic's face here. And so it's at this moment that he has to, like, dig down deep and find, the thing that's going to keep him from going nuts. And so what that thing is, like I mentioned before, I was going to talk about this later, is the age-old wisdom that is gifted to us by both Christianity and Buddhism. Both the Western and Eastern religions agree on this, that life is about suffering, and that suffering actually produces in us character, and which ties into what I was talking about before, or at least what the Colonel from the story was talking about before, that prosperity breeds, weakness. Well, suffering breeds strength of character. And so Vic kind of settles in his head, I need to enjoy the suffering. Now, the question that he asks himself at the end is, if I start enjoying it too much, what happens when I'm unearthed? Because I won't be suffering anymore, and then will I want to go back to that suffering? And that's really interesting, because I know for personally that has happened to me, where there's a special sort of suffering that sometimes you miss, and that's not good. I'm not saying that as a good thing, but I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience where maybe you were in a really bad relationship and it was causing you suffering, but then when you get out of the relationship, all of a sudden, like, you miss the suffering to a degree. Human beings are very strange creatures, but anyways, what ends up happening is Billy shows up. He starts trying to torture Vic, trying to break him, but he can't, because Vic is now in this mode of like, I'm enjoying the suffering. So if I can enjoy the suffering, then give me all the suffering that you can, that you can give. So after that, the Colonel shows up and he starts actually shooting a machine gun around Vic's head to try and finally break him, but he can't. And so Vic tells him like, hey buddy, you missed. And he's like, no, I didn't miss. I was trying to break you. And Vic's like, did I make it? Is that why you're trying to break me? And he's like, you actually passed my time. What I was doing at this very moment, like when I had made it as long as you, I was screaming my guts out. And he basically tells the story of why he was put in this ordeal. The CIA, so he was part of the military, and the CIA thought that he was trading secrets to a foreign power. And so they ended up putting him in this situation to torture him and question him. And after a while, he basically broke and snapped and started confessing all kinds of things that were not actually true. And because of the fact that he had done that, the CIA went and killed a bunch of people that hadn't actually done anything. And so this drove the Colonel crazy. And so the question ends up asking him, so is that why you buried me? Because you wanted to prove that any man going through this ordeal, would snap the same way you did. And you saw how tough I was when I was fighting your men. And so now you wanted to prove to yourself, hey, if this tough guy breaks, then it's okay that I broke. It doesn't make me a less honorable man that I broke. Anyone would break. And so the question is actually very kind, and he ends up kind of comforting the guy and telling him, look, I know all kinds of things. He doesn't say what specifically, but it's all of his training from Richard Dragon. I know all of these things, and that's why I was able to do that. So at this point, the Colonel realizes that it's time to let the question out. And so the noble gentleman, who I forget his name, comes with a shovel, and he's like, hey, we got to dig the guy out. He beat your time, and you told him that you were going to dig him out if he made it. And the Colonel ends up, he starts wondering to himself if this is a good idea. And then Billy comes over and he's like, no, we can't let him out. This guy's a reporter. This guy, he's going to expose all of us. And so the noble guy starts arguing with Billy and telling Billy, like, look, we all agreed to these noble virtues. We can't just go back on our word just because, it's going to cost us. If not, then, everything that we stood for doesn't mean anything. And so Billy and this noble guy, they start fighting, like physically fighting with each other. And so the other two men that are with the Colonel, they start thinking about getting into the fight. But the Colonel's like, no. Let them fight it out. And whoever wins, that's whose kind of moral perspective is going to win out. And so the question poses a question to the Colonel. Are you doing that because you don't want to make the decision yourself? You want to wipe your hands clean of the decision, so that there's no, ultimately there's no blood on your hands, right? Whether it's the questions or their own. And so anyways, Billy ends up shooting the noble gentleman in the stomach. And so he's about to kill the question, but the noble gentleman is still has some fight left in him. Stands up, he bashes Billy in the head with the shovel that he was going to use to unearth the question, and then he kind of collapses because he's injured. And from there, the Colonel realizes that unfortunately he is not as noble as he thought that he was, because of the fact that he was going to let this situation decide for him what was noble. And so he ends up taking a gun and blowing his head off, and then his other two men blow their heads off as well. They kill themselves because they realize that they were not as noble as they thought they were. Now, fortunately for the question, the noble gentleman is still kicking. And so the noble gentleman says, look, I'm bleeding here, I'm bleeding out, but I'm gonna do my best to get you out of the ground as best as I can. And so he starts digging, and then finally he dies. But right before he dies, having opened the ground enough for the question to escape. And we're left with this sad scene with all the men lying dead on the ground, and the question mourning them because he recognizes that they were caught up in a fanaticism. And so, like I said before, that was essentially the question posed at the beginning of the story. I don't know that Denny answers the question, right? These men were obviously fanatics, but what draws the line between the question and the fanatics? And I think that that's what the question is standing there wondering at the end of the issue, like what draws the line between me and these people? Could I have been one of these people, blowing my head off? And I think that that's a question for all of us, like when have we become a fanatic for our cause? And is there any cause that it's okay to be a fanatic for, or are you doing more harm than good once you reach the point of fanaticism? And that's, the question that the question has to wrestle with. At what point is he a fanatic, and at what point is he doing more harm than he's doing good by what he's doing? And is there an answer to that question? Or should we just do as much good as we can while we can? I'll leave all of you with that question. And so, like I tell you every time I do a video, I love anybody that watches this. Thank you so much. And I hope that I'm inspiring you to want to read more of the question, get into the philosophies that the question is trying to wrestle with here, because these stories kind of, to a degree, helped shape the way that I think. And I'm very excited for the next story. I love the next issue I love it. Almost as much as these issues, but I really love it. And I can't actually wait to talk about one specific thing from those issues, from that issue. So I look forward to that. Hope to talk to you guys soon.